Hi, everybody. Welcome to Freedom of Information Oklahoma's August Lunch and Learn series. My name is Andy Moore. I am your host for today. I don't know what the role is, but I'm the executive director of Freedom of Information Oklahoma. I'm excited you're here. I want to acknowledge that this meeting is being recorded, including the chat, because that's how it works. And so we can post that on our YouTube channel later for anyone who wasn't able to make it today. And in fact, if I can find my chat, I will post the link to our YouTube channel in the chat in case you want to go back and watch any of our other lunch and learns or any other content we might have on there. I'm very excited about our guest today. It's Mark Thomas, who you can probably see on your screen. Mark is the executive vice president at the Oklahoma Press Association and a longtime member of the FOI Oklahoma Board of Directors. Today's session is entitled Open Meetings in a Virtual World, which I thought was catchy. And we are doing this because, well, this is the first of our Lunch and Learn series, I think, that we've done this year that is solely or primarily focused on the Open Meeting Act. We chose this topic because COVID has had, just an enormous impact on public meetings and how they're held. And I think arguably outside of maybe education and just the economy in general, this is one of the areas of law that has received perhaps the most attention. And I don't think that's just because this is what I do for a living. I think a lot of people are genuinely interested in some cases concerned about how our government is making the shift to allow the public to still have oversight and still participate in public meetings. Mark has been, I think, at the center of those conversations, and I'm excited to talk to him today with you as we go through this. I do also want to highlight, before we get rolling, that the Oklahoma Press Association publishes the little yellow book that we often reference on here. I have one here in my hand about open meetings and open records. It has has the law and all the citations. This, however, is the 21st edition, and the new 22nd edition, I believe, is scheduled to be published this fall. The Press Association sells them on their website. I will put the link in the chat now. If you're watching this on YouTube later, I will put that link in the description below the video as well. This is, if you were interested or care about open meeting or Open Records Act, this is a valuable resource. I don't get any kickback for telling you that. I'm just telling you this is a really useful book. I have one on my desk, and I have one in my computer bag that downstairs as well, because you never know when you need to reference that material. And we really appreciate OPA for publishing that. So I think now you can only sign up to be notified. You can't, for when it's going to be out, you can't actually purchase it just yet. But there's that. Okay, well, let's get going. And as we go along, for those of you who are watching from out in computer land, please feel free to submit questions. Zoom has like the Q&A feature as well as the chat. I'll monitor both sides. You can ask questions as we go along if they are fresh on your mind. We will also set aside some time at the end to address those questions. So you're welcome to hold on to those in case we address them as we go along. So, all right, Mark, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Let me check. Can you hear me all right?
We can. I can, at least. Hopefully the audience can as well.
Hearing,
I just realized I have all these supplements to the yellow book floating around my desk. Let me pile those up.
Hearing me and understanding me are two completely separate things. So hopefully we can combine both before this is all over.
Yeah. Mark, let's start with talking about the Open Meeting Act as it existed. We'll flash back to January 2020 so that we can kind of chart the course of what really had to change over the last year. So pre-COVID, in the before times, there were some, I don't know, provisions is the right word, but there was some language pertaining to video conferences for open meetings in the law, but not, I think not in the way that most of the public might expect, and certainly not how we've grown used to them over the last year. Can you kind of give us an overview of what things looked like back then?
I can. There were some provisions in the Open Meetings Act that we put in years ago. And just a brief history is that, the Open Meetings Act, as you know, came about in 1977. Then it started to change a little bit over time. And one of the first changes that was made, it was in the 80s when they said, the state banking board needs to be able to just meet without notice by phone. For those of you that lived through the early 80s, when the savings and loan industry was crashing and the banks were failing, they said, I don't think we should be giving a 24-hour notice, posting it on the door that we're going to meet and go into executive session to discuss First National Bank of this town that we're going to take over tomorrow. That would cause a run on the bank. And so we need a special exception to have no notice and to meet by phone. And so that was one of the first real ventures into a state board meeting by phone. It was the state banking board and the savings and loan board. Well, when they started doing it, then the act started over time, more boards added, state regions of higher education, and then another board, then this district attorney's council, and you started having a long list of public bodies that said, can we meet by teleconference too? And eventually that list got pretty long. And we thought, if this just keeps going this way, every public body will be listed in statute. Let's stop that. And so in about 2006, we started writing just some rules for all public bodies. And that developed over time as we found different abuses that were happening. We changed those laws in the Open Meeting Act, that law in 307.1 to basically say all public bodies can video conference, or it said teleconference. And this is a confusing thing now because back then teleconference was widely viewed as video conferencing. It was not. Teleconferencing was what we're doing today, seeing and talking to each other. That was teleconferencing. Now we think of it as video conferencing, but that wasn't a word then. It was just all teleconferencing. So today we would think teleconference is being solely on the phone and video conference being audio and visual together. So there's some confusion there, and there's still confusion.
Sure.
But anyway, so we wrote those laws in 06, 07, 08. We kind of amended them over time. And it sat there as a piece of the Open Meetings Act that was rarely used, because why would you when you could all just drive to a meeting? People went to the meeting, and that was back in the olden days of 3 years ago when people you were on a board, you went to a meeting. And sat through the meeting, no matter how long it lasted, and you did the public's business right there where the public could see you. So that was the law. And so those laws were in place, but nobody really used them. And ironically, we're sort of boomeranged back around. Those are the laws we're under today,
right?
By and large, okay?
Yeah.
So does that make sense? It's all in 307.1 of the Open Meetings Act. Okay.
That does make sense. It is funny. I remember working for a public entity and having to, drive to Tulsa for a 45-minute meeting and then turn around and drive back. But we had to be there in person for the meeting. And that is, I think, a very different expectation than how things go right now. So yeah, so go ahead.
So it became, so when COVID started to become a thing, people started looking at the video conferencing laws that we had and said, we need to liberalize this and really make it, because the law we're under now and existed prior to COVID said a quorum of the public body had to be at the main meeting site together, and a minority of the body could video conference in. And they said, well, wait a minute, what if all 9 members of the board need to be remote so they're not infecting each other? So they liberalized that. This was all through Senate Bill 661, which was the last bill passed on the last day of the session as the legislature was exiting the building to try and stay safe. They did come back in the building and do some things after that, after a few weeks, but just emergency things to get the budget done. So, but Senate Bill 661 that liberalized a lot of those things. You didn't have to have a quorum. You could just call it in. You could do an executive session by teleconference. Those things were, that bill expired on November 15th of that year. Okay. And when November 15th happened, November 15th, 2020, people kind of panicked. They thought, oh no, we've got to go back into meetings again.
Right. Well, because I want to just provide some context in case we've forgotten, because a lot has happened over the last year, right? So this was passed in March of 2020. So in the very early days of the pandemic, when we just had a few handfuls of cases, and then it expired in November when we had copious amounts of cases. And it was, back in March of last year, I think we all thought maybe this will blow over. And so it was a stopgap measure to get us through. And then the legislature, adjourned, and then here we were in a real pickle where we had tons of COVID around and no law to really allow us to continue meeting.
Right. No, well, it expired and we went back to the old rules, to the old law, which was they could meet virtually, but a quorum had to be in place. You couldn't do executive session by video conference and et cetera. So we went back to the old rules. So it wasn't the end of the world as many had thought. By then, a lot of people had put in precautions. They were meeting in bigger rooms. They had panels between members. They had COVID testing and some other things that we didn't really have early on. So it was not the end of the world when it expired on November 15th, although some felt it was. So, and in fact, a lot of public bodies were asking the governor to call a special session in November of 2020 just to extend the Open Meetings Act, where we could meet really with very few rules by video conference, but they didn't do that. The legislature didn't do that. But when we came around to February, the first bill that was filed and passed, and it takes 5 days to get a bill passed, and so by the 5th day, they had basically readopted the 661 rules and said those would expire on February 15th of 2022 or until 30 days after the governor lifted the COVID-19 state of emergency. So we had 661 rules. They expired on November 15th. We went back to the old rules. By February 10th, we were back under the 661 rules. Then they expired on June 4th. So now we're back to the very thing the very laws we had prior to COVID even starting. So there are video conferencing options. There are just some rules there that you have to follow that are a little more strict than they were prior to COVID.
Right. Yeah. Now, so during the 661 rules, either period, I know there were some concerns that a lot of people had about, I will use the term loosening the rules for that, but there were some concerns about how things could be manipulated to maybe actually reduce transparency instead of enhancing it. Can you talk a little bit about some of those concerns?
Well, some of those concerns were primarily around that a public official no longer had to participate in a public meeting from a place that was open to the public, or where the public could have access to that public official. So we had, under 661, we had people driving around in their pickup with a friend calling it in. We had a city councilman in a city who got on his bike and had a helmet with a GoPro camera, and he drove around Lake Thunderbird while he voted on public business. So you couldn't really have access to the person. So you didn't really know who they could meet in private, and they could have anyone in there with them they wanted to have in there. And a lot of people said, well, you can see me on television. You can see me. That's good enough. But it's not really good enough. Just what you see on the screen doesn't show you what's happening off the screen. Who else is in the room? Who else is in there influencing a public official? So that reduction of being able to actually go and see my public official voting and see who else was in there influencing that vote was very concerning to a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. You and I talked about this a few weeks ago, and that same analogy was stood out to me of you can see the person on the camera, but not anyone who might be behind the camera. And it, really clicked, I think, that with contentious votes that might have legal implications, if there's someone that's participating in the meeting and they have, I don't know, their own attorney behind there that's like, do not say that, or holding up cue cards for things, suddenly this meeting is remarkably different than what it should be, arguably, right? And there is, I think, something to be said for being physically present in front of your peers or your constituents and having to make a hard vote or to say something or to listen to them. That this is like one of those little things that I think, while Zoom is great in lots of ways, but this is something that's certainly lost, right? Is that human contact component.
Right. And I do not want to discount the fact that more members of the public watched meetings than ever before, which was terrific on for society as a whole and for transparency as a whole. But that didn't necessarily should not be the only way you could watch your public official in action. And those were some of the abuses that we were seeing back when we wrote these rules back in 06, 07, 08, 09, when we were writing some of these rules. Rules such as you had to put, where if you were going to participate from a video conference, you had to put the location you were going to be, and you couldn't change it after it was posted. Under 661, you could say I'm participating from video conference and then change your mind and go down to the county courthouse. And we had that a lot of times where people said, okay, well, let's say we're all participating by video conference. And if we all show down up the county courthouse to have our meeting, it'll still be okay. So in other words, you've faked out the public. You've told them I'm going to be at this library and this room over here and this room. And when the public gets over there to see you, you've run to another place. The old laws prior to 661 didn't allow that, and the current law doesn't allow that either. So there are those kinds of rules we put in place, as well as having to participate from some place that's in the area from which you are elected or sworn to represent. I realize that in a small town that gets smaller and smaller. And it's easier at that point to just go to a meeting. But what the abuse we had back in 06, 07 is we had people that volunteered to serve on boards and never went to the school building, never went to the city council building, never participated from their district. They were in New York. They were in Dallas. They were just calling it in from other locations and never participated in an actual meeting from their area. And it was particularly true when there was a hot vote. If I'm going to fire the football coach, you should have to sit there and listen to the players and their parents, who show up at those kind of meetings, right? I don't know, if we're going to fire the coach or do something hot, I should be able to escape and participate from hundreds of miles away, and when the meeting's over, hang up and not have to face anyone And there's just something about facing the public when you take a vote that's important.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated thing, right? Because you've highlighted it well that there's on the one hand, virtual video conferencing does allow more people to participate, both from an audience or attendee perspective, to view it. That's important, and to view it in real time, right? A lot of meetings are recorded and you can watch them later, but that's, by that point, history has been recorded. But to be able to watch in real time, and using some platforms even participate, right? So allowing, even public comment in some cases, that's a big deal. And it also, in a state like Oklahoma, or really anywhere, it allows more people on the public body to maybe have broader geographic representation without compromising their whole day or week or something, right? Like you can sit on a statewide transportation board or something, and it's easier to do that and your other duties. And so that might make it, I don't know, easier for some folks to be willing to serve. But that comes at a cost. Like there's an either or trade-off here, that means that they're not there, and they can make the hard vote and then boop, just disconnect, right? The meeting can end. And if they're in person, you don't just like magically like shoot into the floor or something and hide from people. And you can hear the groans in the audience. You can feel the room in a different way. And that, I think, is important in lots of ways too. And I mean, I think all of us, we're watching this on Zoom. I would much rather be in person. It'd be a much different dynamic, right? To have this conversation in front of a live studio audience, as it was. And I think how we move forward, right, has to weigh all of these things.
That's
Even
right.
not to get too geeky, but I was watching Star Wars with my son a couple of weeks ago and thought about this, because on the newfangled Star Wars, they had like all of the Jedi Council, and some of them were participating via hologram, right? And like a little glowing Yoda is not the same as having Yoda in the room, and they're trying to act like it is. And I was like, and even this, like, I think like Lucas has figured out that it's not the same if you're not physically there in person. And as soon as they disappeared, the other Jedi Council members like had another conversation and made decisions without everybody present. And I was like, I don't think they have the Open Meeting Act in Star Wars world, but this seems like they'd be violating some of the provisions there.
Well, I, um, I, I think we wanted the standard for public service to still be, if you're going to serve, you've got to somehow engage with the public in that service, rather than saying, I'll serve on this board as long as I never have to leave my house, never have to see the public, never have to see anyone before, after, or during a meeting, and hang up. And I'll be, oh, sure, I'll spend all the county money. I'll spend all the city money. I'll spend all the school money, as long as I never have to really engage the public. And what's convenient for the public viewing on Zoom and what's convenient for a public body are two different things. And so we were not trying to be inconvenient to the public body. We want public bodies to work efficiently, but we need to have transparency while it's happening. And sometimes the only way for that to happen is when they're there. And additionally, while there's no legal obligation for them to speak to a person after a meeting. I mean, I saw a city council meeting in Claremore where they voted on something, and a softball coach ran up after it was over to say, I don't understand what you just voted on. My parents are asking me what to do, and I don't think I understand what you just did. Can you explain this to me? I mean, it was immediate. Those kinds of interactions really help us move forward, rather than just voting, hanging up, and then the confusion that comes afterwards because people online didn't really understand. So we want it to be convenient, but shouldn't just be so convenient that there is no sacrifice related to public service anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting, and this is a good point to kind of pivot and talk about what the future might look like, and how people can even be involved, right? Like this is a discussion and an issue that I think we all have to kind of wrestle with individually and collectively as a society of, how do we strike the best balance between accessibility and convenience and all these things. So looking ahead, and not to really nail you down on anything, but if you had to look into a crystal ball, do you think that this, given everything that's happened over the last year and is still happening, that we will see additional tweaks made to the Open Meeting Act to help kind of figure some of this stuff out?
Certainly, I think it'll be an ongoing discussion. Um, and it will be legislation next year to try and certainly clean it up some. I mean, when we had a law and then 661 and it went away, and then 1031 and it went away, and I mean, for example, in the law now, it says after the governor, if the governor removes the state of emergency, section C and D are no longer valid. Well, section C and D are still in the law. You just have to read the part that says they're no longer valid. So there's a lot of cleanup that would have to be done, because it can get very confusing to people trying to follow the law. You've got to really have followed the three-ring circus that we've had over the last couple of years of amending and changing and expiring and reinstating and amending again and so forth. So I think going forward, certainly, I think there'll be changes. I think we'll probably have some changes in allowing, for example, people that are participating by video conference or teleconference to count towards the quorum. I don't really, I think there'll be some changes there. There's some changes, I think, probably in the wings about public comment. The current law says if you're going to have public comment at the main meeting site, you have to have it at all the remote meeting sites in the same way. And that's been very problematic for public bodies to have public comment at all of the sites. Technologically, they don't really know how to do that. So we're going to have to try and tweak that some, I think, because the practical effect of that is they said, we're just going to stop having public comment. And that was not really a good alternative. Since we can't follow the law and have it in each place, we'll just do away with it altogether. So we're going to have to work together with public agencies to figure out those kind of things. And I think the biggest issue also is the issue of executive session. Under the old law and the existing law, you cannot have an executive session by video conference or teleconference, whatever you want to call it. You can't do it. Under 661, you could, and then it expired, and then you could again, and now you can't. So I think there are some, I think there will probably be some changes there, because it's hard to have a lot of these public meetings without having some executive session opportunity there. So all of those things are all under discussion, and we'll try and figure all those things out this fall and meet with a lot of state agencies, cities, schools, counties, nonprofit boards, everyone that's subject to the act, and try and work our way through a practical way where the public and the public bodies can really have a common understanding of what's acceptable to all of us and what we can do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The executive session thing, sometimes I wonder if we are like at a difficult technological crossroads, right? Like under 661, you could do executive session in a virtual meeting, but people were on Zoom and they basically just had to like kick everyone off and then do a separate one. And then how do you know when they come back from session, right? And so there wasn't like a good, easy to use technology solution for that. Although I know tons of companies are working on it, and I anticipate that the possibility of that working well will get better as time moves on. But we're in a bit of a window period here.
Correct. And on the point of executive session, you don't know whether it's going to last 10 minutes or 5 hours. And so if you've been kicked off the meeting or just taken out, and are you supposed to sit online 5 hours and wait until it starts back up and they return to open session and vote on something in 1 minute and they're gone? That didn't seem, that was very problematic.
Yeah.
For a lot of people. So those are all things you cannot do it now. You cannot meet by executive session by video conference or teleconference now. So under the existing law. So, but I think there'll be some kind of method worked out where if they are allowed to go into executive session by video conference or teleconference, that there'll be some process by which they come out and have to notify people, and the people have to be allowed an ample time to log back on.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that really works, but we're talking through that process.
Yeah.
And as long as we're on that point, that was another problem, was that the code for a lot of these calls, because we're on Zoom, but there were 27 different web type meeting applications being used throughout the state by different public bodies of all kinds. So am I supposed to have 27 web apps on my phone, and I'm WebEx here and Zoom here, and I've got to pay attention to all these meetings? It was difficult. I was suggesting we try and, as a state, try and find a platform and stick with it, and let's have everybody use that. We had some that used platforms where the person had to pay a fee to sign up to get it. And you had some where, a lot of them, where the code that was required was not given out in advance of the meeting. You had to keep calling the clerk and they'd give it to you 5 minutes before the meeting. But if you got disconnected at some point in the meeting and you call back, well, the clerk's in there taking minutes. They're not taking calls saying, oh, here's a new code, or here's the problem. So if you got kicked off at the wrong time, you couldn't get back on. So the current law, by the way, now says, and part of the law that did not expire says, and this is important, it says if there's a code or a password to be able to log into the meeting, that's got to be on the notice and the agenda of the meeting. I think it says notice and agenda. That's in section 311 of the act. And it says it must be included in the public notice. So yes, if you're given a notice of a meeting and you're doing it by Zoom, you've got to put the code on the notice of the meeting. You can't make people wait 5 minutes before the meeting and have a flood of calls. That was another problem we were having regularly.
Right. We're going to get to questions just a minute. So audience, if you have any questions, now's the time. Feel free to flood the chat or the Q&A. Oh, good. They're coming in already. But as people type in their questions, I was going to ask you a little bit about meeting notices, because I feel like that's been another sticky point as we've been adjusting to this virtual format. Specifically, like if you're having a virtual meeting, but the law also requires you to post notice somewhere, what is a public body supposed to do?
Well, the law gives public bodies the option now of posting. The old law for years said, you had to post it in a prominent place, prominent public view 24 hours in advance. And that essentially meant on the door of the meeting place. And there's an option now that says if you have a lot of meetings, you don't want to wallpaper the entire door every night, you can set up an email system where a citizen can sign up and get a free email and get the actual notice and agenda sent to them by email whenever there is one. So several of the larger cities are doing that. Most of the smaller ones are not. They're still just posting it on the door. You can go down 24 hours in advance of the meeting and look at what's on the agenda. But I think we'll come up with some improved hybrid system where the notice is widely available. It's either, people say, well, just put on the website. Well, the Rural Water District 3 of LaFleur County does not have a website. They don't have a Facebook page. They don't have anything, you know. They have an office with a door. So you can't really require a lot of things because you think a lot of state agencies have certain capabilities and they don't. But when you get lower down in government, the technological competence and capabilities start to decrease. So we have to think of all levels of open meetings at all levels of government.
Yeah. I do think that's an important thing to point out, and it actually is a good lead into our first question here. But the Open Meeting Act applies to state agencies, stuff under the executive branch, and but then also, you know, municipal things, county things, universities, like any kind of body that, in general terms, receives a significant part of their budget from public funds, and that includes many, you know, nonprofits, big and small. And so you have a wide range of capacity to adjust to this stuff, and a lot of folks are really just trying to keep up, right? And so actually our first question, this has been a great conversation. I think we've covered a lot, and our first question here from April cuts to the chase, which I like. And she says, our nonprofit board has recently become anxious about the recent surge of COVID. Can you talk about what stipulations are in place within the current law for video conferencing? So basically reiterate where we are right now for those entities that are trying to figure out what they can do.
Where we are right now, since there's not a state of emergency, and even if there was a state of emergency, the governor would have to go in and declare some special meetings act. But where we are right now, April, is that a majority of your body would have to be together someplace. They can be in a large room, they can social distance, but a majority of your body would have to be together, and a minority of the body can call in. So if you have 14 members on your board, 8 of them would have to be together, and 6 could call in, or something like that. The majority would have to, a quorum would have to be all in the room together doing it. So they could participate, and the people doing it remotely could participate, but they would have to participate in some place that was open to the public. Now, does that mean the city park? Does that mean your front porch? It says open to the public. Our original thought was a public building, because public buildings have the proper accommodations for all people and so forth. But we said, no, it just needs to be open to the public. It can't be, it doesn't have to be a public building. So it could be anywhere where you've got a signal and you can participate. So you'll have to look at right now at the current law, section 307.1. When you get down to the part where it says section C and D are no longer valid after the governor lifts the state of emergency, which he did on May the 3rd. So by June the 4th, we're back to the original rules in 307.1.
Yeah, good answer. It is tough, right? And I want to reiterate what you said. While the governor has signaled repeatedly that he has no plans to issue a state of emergency, we know that things can change in this environment. And so if that happened, that declaration of a state of emergency would undoubtedly include many provisions about what it actually means. And so if it happened, and if that declaration contains some provisions pertaining to the Open Meeting Act, we would be revisiting that very closely to understand what it means, and trying to put out some guidance. What role does the Attorney General's office play, if any, in helping the public understand what the law says, and if public bodies are following it correctly?
Well, the Attorney General's office is the attorney for basically the state agencies, and they also issue opinions if you're qualified to ask for an opinion, like a state legislator or somebody who has standing there, because they are the state's attorney. So they're advising state agencies and so forth, but and they are really one that we look to try and help give all of us guidance, because if their opinion and their interpretation matters, Um, like in the old words of Drew Edmondson, when we were at one of these meetings around the state talking about open meetings, and they said, well, my attorney who happened to work for a city told me something different. And Drew Edmondson said, well, I don't think your attorney is going to be the one prosecuting you in one of the grand jury. It's going to be me. So I think what I'm saying it means a lot more than what your attorney says that it means. Now, the Attorney General's office would say, always listen to your local counsel, but they also provide, I think, pretty sound advice on how to interpret it. And after 661, they came out with an FAQ #1, and then they came out with an FAQ #2. And it's still on the Attorney General's website. But those were about Senate Bill 661, not about the current law that we have now. So if that makes sense. So
those frequently asked questions were, I think, really helpful, because in my opinion, I feel like it is they were worded in a way that was very accessible and approachable to everybody as a non-attorney, right? And we have those on the FOI website on our blog as well. We put those out and tried to talk about it. We have a whole section on virtual meetings. We did back then, and because they're just saying, here's what the law says, is sometimes not enough to really explain it in a way that is approachable, I think, for a lot of people. Well, we are winding down on time here. If we have any other questions from the audience, please feel free to enter it. But Mark, is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important to note about the Open Meetings Act, and particularly how it relates to virtual stuff, virtual world?
Well, I think it's just like it's always been since the 80s. It's an evolving and expanding and contracting set of laws. We think this will be a good idea, let's try this, and then we see abuses creeping in, and we try and tighten that up, and then we expand and contract over time. So the Open Meetings Act itself, it is just an agreement between the public and the government on how we're going to meet and learn about what government's doing. It's not always us versus them, because we are a self-governing society. It's us and us agreeing on how we're going to meet, and that's what this is. It's in the video conferencing part is how are we going to meet where public bodies and government can work efficiently while yet being accountable to the public. Efficiency is great. Dictatorships are very efficient and not very accountable. And so we don't want to loosen the rules where they're allowed to do anything they want with no accountability and no transparency and no interaction with the public. So we're always trying to find that sweet spot in the middle, and it moves around a little bit, and it'll move a little more by the time the session gets here next February. But yeah, I think people need to be cautious, need to take care of themselves, and consult your doctor, as they all say. But still, I think we're moving to a more virtual world, and we need to figure out how to do that in a way that still provides accountability to the public, and not is just the public sitting at home watching government on television. That's not really how it works. And a lot of my friends, they said, why not? Why not? Why can't I see you on the screen? And I said, well, when you were watching them count votes in the Philadelphia Convention Center, you wanted observers in there watching them count votes. You wanted someone from both parties watching them count. Why did you want someone in the room watching when they were counting? Why wasn't just watching it on television good enough? Well, because you don't really know what's happening unless you're in the room observing. And so we'll get to a more virtual world to make it more convenient for some public officials and more convenient for the public, yet still be able to be observed and be accountable to the public that wants to be there, wants to be involved in the government.
Yeah, I mean, in a very different note, like the Olympics, there was no fans this year, right? And it just felt different, even watching it at home. I've never been to the Olympics, but I would assume it is much different if you're there. And I realized this year, even at home for me, it was different without the energy of the crowd, right? So just that lack of public presence affects the whole thing. All right, we have two questions, and then we'll wrap up. First question is from Julie. She says, right now, we have to make the minutes available to the public. Do you foresee any requirements to make available, Zoom recordings or other similar recordings of a meeting? And then relatedly, what about recording devices like smart pens that might be utilized by staff as a tool for writing of minutes?
Um, Currently, it says that the current law in definition in 304 also says that they have to be recorded, and it says either written or recorded or other means. I don't know, written or recorded. I don't know what other means there would be, but that's in. So I think you will have to still have minutes. Now, I can foresee a future where if you're having a video conference meeting or a teleconference meeting that is a public body, you would be required to keep that. You would be required to record it and make it available for inspection or copying or viewing, shall we say, for a certain period of time until the actual minutes of the meeting are written and preserved and saved. So I mean, that was a problem we had this time is it was a Zoom meeting or it was a video meeting, but as soon as it was over, they ditched the recording right away and gave you a written copy of what happened. So you had to record the meeting on your computer if you could figure out how to do that. So I can foresee that as a future requirement, but not necessarily saving video tapes of meetings for the last 25 years. I'm not sure how helpful that would be in the long run, but for a limited period of time, so the public, and other public officials could go back and watch it, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I can see some value in having an archive of video footage. Like I frequently go back and review footage from the state legislature from past sessions. Sometimes that's helpful. And I think from a historical perspective, that's perhaps interesting. But we also run into a technological challenge there of maintaining the fidelity of these digital files, to say nothing about the volume of storage that it starts to eat up, right? Like I started saving all of my home videos and stuff, and I've this year have bought 2 external hard drives just to keep them stored, and I still worry about what happens when something gets damaged. And so there's a
Right.
lot of things to consider there.
So it's a technological issue as well as I mean, you have to be sensitive to the financial issues that you're
Right.
putting on some of these small public bodies who may not have a lot of money. You're asking them to store things that for a long period of time. Storing for a short period of time, I think you can we can probably get there with most of them, but again, when they're spending money on storing those things, they're spending our money. So let's be, how much of our money do we want to spend storing something 20 years old?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's not insurmountable, but something to consider. I think that's
right.
Yeah. Our second question is from Sandra, fellow FOI Oklahoma board member. Mark, can you talk about some problems that have occurred in the last year related to allowing for public input during open meetings?
Well, first of all, everybody I think may understand that public comment is not required by the Open Meetings Act. And it has not been required since the beginning of the act. And it is allowed in the public body, allows it, and then they set rules that are fair to everyone. Okay. And so I think the problems we've had are that, particularly with the original act pre-COVID, where it said you had to allow people to comment from each place. They didn't technologically know how to do that. And so they cut off those, just stopped having public comment at all. And so, because, I mean, you've got to remember, I mean, there are fines and penalties and jail terms associated with violating the act. So you have to, there's a lot of concern about that. And and I think those are legitimate concerns. So, they don't want to violate the act. So they kind of take the safe route and say, well, since we're not required to have public comment and we can't really technologically make it work, let's just not do it for a while. So, and that has caused an uproar in quite a few places where public comment was just a staple of public meetings in your town or county or school. So I think there have been several instances where it's been a problem, Oklahoma County being the most vocal, I think.
Yeah.
But I think we'll come back to a reasonable sense of what public comment is in a virtual world. We're not really there yet. We weren't there at public comment in a physical world. We weren't really there yet either. So where it was all required. So I think we'll get there, but it takes a lot of discussion. I mean, with all of the affected parties to figure out how that works best.
Sure. All right, one last question, since we've got a few minutes, and then we'll be done. This question's from John. Mark, what do you do about meeting minutes that are limited to, Mr. Smith made a motion and it was seconded by Mr. Jones, but the actual motion itself was not recorded, or any discussion, let's say they have 45 minutes of discussion about that motion. Does the law need a better definition of what goes in the minutes?
It probably does. The definition now is basically it has the minutes. I'll basically have to have what item you were taking up and what action they took on that item. So it doesn't say you've got to provide the discussion or even a flavor of the discussion in the minutes of the meeting. Now in a video, when you can go back and watch a video of the actual meeting, you can see the whole thing. And that's very helpful to the public, I think. But the minutes themselves are very Spartan in what is required to be in the minutes of the meeting. And I get this question a lot from clerks, and I talk to a lot of public officials, and they ask me what should be in the minutes. And I say this to them generally: go back and read minutes from 25 years ago from your own town or your school, and read those minutes. Can you tell what they were voting on and what happened? And if you cannot, that's probably not sufficient as a set of minutes. I mean, written minutes that from 10, 15, 20 years ago are supposed to be to help us remember what we did and what we said 25 years ago, so we will know how did we get to today. The only way we know, I mean, it's none of the other animals can write down for posterity what they did and what they said. We are different from everyone else. We can write down and learn from our mistakes of the past, but only if we recorded what those mistakes that we voted on are actually recorded in the minutes of those meetings. So one practical piece of advice is go back and read old minutes. If you can't figure out what they were talking about or why they voted a certain way, those minutes probably need a little more depth. And that's how you should probably be doing your own minutes.
Good answer. This is the one case in life where it's probably good to write down things, right? Mark, thank you so much for being here today. This has been very enlightening, and I hope it was, I'm sure it was useful to all of our audience. And everyone else, thank you for being here. You are the real reason we're here. Otherwise, it would just be Mark and I talking to ourselves, and that's no fun for anyone. As I mentioned earlier, this video is being recorded. I will post it to the FOI Oklahoma YouTube channel here in just as soon as it renders, basically in the next, hopefully 30 minutes. Next month, our Lunch and Learn is on September 8th. That is also a Wednesday. And the topic will be transparency in healthcare, and where the line between open records and HIPAA intersect or don't. Our guest panelists will be Paul Monies from Oklahoma Watch and Cassie McClung from the Frontier, two of the folks that have been on the front lines of covering the COVID pandemic over the past year and a half, and who have an immense amount of experience and probably frustration of navigating that line. I hope you can join us. If you tell your friends, please invite them if they think it'll be useful. And golly, who knows what the pandemic will look like by the time we meet next month to talk about it. So until then, have a great week and stay safe out there.